At 2:17 a.m. on January 8, 1966, Specialist 4 James Henderson crouched at the edge of a tunnel entrance 20 miles north of Cu Chi, staring into darkness so complete it felt solid. He had a flashlight, a pistol, and explicit orders from Captain Herbert Thornton to map every inch of what intelligence believed was a minor Viet Cong supply cache. In the next 6 hours, Henderson would discover a subterranean city stretching 200 kilometers beneath the jungle, a network so vast and sophisticated that it would trap, kill, and psychologically destroy thousands of American soldiers over the next 4 years. The official U.S. Army manual listed 23 approved methods for neutralizing enemy fortifications. Underground tunnel complexes of this scale weren't among them. Division Command would spend 3 years denying what Henderson found that morning, even as body counts rose and morale collapsed. But 30 feet below the surface, in corridors barely wide enough for one man to crawl, a different war was being fought, one where technology meant nothing and American firepower was rendered useless, where men died from snake bites and punji stakes and suffocation, where the enemy could appear from nowhere and vanish into the earth like ghosts. Henderson aimed his flashlight down into the hole. The beam disappeared into blackness. Somewhere in that darkness he could hear water dripping and smell the copper tang of blood mixed with wet clay. One chance, one decision that would change everything. He started climbing down. James Henderson grew up in Bakersfield, California, where his father worked construction building irrigation systems for the oil fields, 12-hour days in the sun, laying pipe through desert hardpan that fought back with every shovel strike. James was the youngest of 4 boys, the one who spent afternoons crawling through drainage culverts to clear blockages that nobody else wanted to touch. The work taught him that tight spaces didn't bother him the way they bothered other people. While his brothers complained about the claustrophobia of working in confined channels, James found something almost peaceful about it. The darkness, the focus, the way problems became simple when you couldn't see more than 3 feet in any direction. At 19, he was working demolition in Los Angeles, clearing out condemned buildings before the wrecking balls arrived. He learned which structures were safe to enter and which ones would collapse if you breathed wrong, how to read the language of cracks in concrete and the way wood groaned under stress, how to move through spaces that wanted to kill you. He enlisted in March 1965, 2 months after his 20th birthday. The recruiter promised training, decent pay, and a technical specialty that would translate to civilian work. Henderson got 10 weeks of basic, an M14 rifle he qualified expert with on his first attempt, and a plane to South Vietnam via Hawaii and the Philippines. By the time he reached Cu Chi in November 1965, he'd learned the recruiter had been right about exactly one thing. The training was excellent. Everything else was a carefully constructed lie. The 25th Infantry Division established its base camp at Cu Chi in January 1966, setting up one of the largest American installations in Vietnam. 25,000 soldiers, complete with helicopter pads, maintenance facilities, hospitals, supply depots, ammunition bunkers, and every piece of infrastructure needed to support a major combat operation. The location was strategic. Cu Chi District set 25 kilometers northwest of Saigon along Highway 1, the main artery connecting the capital to the rest of the country. Control Cu Chi, and you controlled access to Saigon. Lose Cu Chi, and enemy forces had a clear path to the heart of South Vietnam. What nobody told the 25th Division was that they were building their base directly on top of the most extensive underground tunnel network in Southeast Asia. Within 48 hours of establishing the perimeter, strange things started happening. Helicopter engines that had been fine at sunset were mysteriously damaged by morning. Food supplies vanished from locked storage buildings. Soldiers on guard duty reported movement inside the wire that disappeared when illuminated. On February 4th, 1966, Private First Class Robert Martinez was found dead in his cot, throat cut, in a tent surrounded by other sleeping men. Nobody heard anything. Nobody saw anyone enter or leave. The only evidence was a set of muddy footprints that led to a drainage culvert and then vanished. On February 11th, a Chinook helicopter exploded on the pad during pre-flight checks. No mechanical failure, no enemy fire. Just a perfectly placed explosive charge underneath the fuel tank. Investigators found a tunnel entrance 40 feet from the helicopter pad, covered with a trapdoor so expertly camouflaged that even after they knew it was there, soldiers had trouble locating it a second time. On February 23rd, an entire ammunition depot detonated. 3 soldiers killed, 17 wounded, millions of dollars in ordnance destroyed. The blast crater revealed a tunnel opening directly beneath the depot's foundation. The tunnel led down 30 feet, then branched in 4 directions, then disappeared into a network nobody had known existed. Division intelligence initially dismissed the tunnels as isolated foxholes, temporary fighting positions the Viet Cong dug and abandoned. The first investigation concluded the network was maybe 2 kilometers in total length, a minor nuisance that could be neutralized with smoke grenades and demolition charges. They were wrong by a factor of 100. The tunnel system beneath Cu Chi stretched 250 kilometers, not 250 feet, not 25 kilometers, 250 kilometers of interconnected passages running underneath the jungle, connecting villages, supply depots, hospitals, command centers, and fighting positions across an entire province. The tunnels had been under construction since 1948, when the Viet Minh fought the French for independence. They dug the first tunnels as hiding spots and ammunition caches. Simple affairs, maybe 20 feet deep, with single entrances and no ventilation systems. After the Geneva Accords partitioned Vietnam in 1944, the Southern resistance forces inherited these rudimentary tunnels and began expanding them. By 1960, when American advisors first arrived in significant numbers, the tunnel network had grown to over 100 kilometers. By 1965, when the 25th Division landed, it had doubled. The construction was astonishing. The tunnels were hand-dug using basic tools, shovels, baskets, hands. The displaced dirt was hauled away in small amounts and scattered across rice paddies to avoid detection from aerial reconnaissance. The digging happened at night, in increments of inches. A village might add 50 feet to its section of tunnel over the course of a year. Multiply that by 50 villages, and suddenly you have a subterranean highway system. The soil in Cu Chi district was perfect for tunneling. Red clay with enough natural cohesion to hold its shape without timber reinforcement. Low water table meant the tunnel stayed dry even during monsoon season. The clay hardened after digging, creating walls strong enough to resist all but direct bomb hits. The tunnel systems typically had 3 levels. The first level sat 10 to 15 feet below the surface. Fighting positions, observation posts, entrances and exits. This was the most dangerous level, most vulnerable to detection, and most likely to be targeted by American demolition teams. The second level ran 20 to 25 feet down. Living quarters, storage, kitchens with chimney systems designed to diffuse smoke so it was invisible from above. Conference rooms where military operations were planned. Hospitals where wounded fighters recovered. Schools where children continued their education even during B-52 strikes that turned the surface into a moonscape. The third level descended 30 feet or more. Command centers, ammunition depots, critical infrastructure that needed maximum protection. Some sections went even deeper. Investigators eventually found chambers 40 feet underground, accessible only through vertical shafts with multiple watertight trapdoors designed to seal automatically if the upper levels were flooded or gassed. The tunnels themselves were deliberately narrow, 18 inches wide, 2.5 feet high in most sections. Barely enough room for a thin Vietnamese man to crawl through on his belly. Americans, larger on average and carrying more equipment, found the passages almost impossibly tight. The narrowness was tactical. It limited the effectiveness of American soldiers attempting to clear the tunnels, and it prevented the use of dogs, which were too big to navigate the smallest passages. The tunnels zigzagged constantly. No straight sections longer than 15 feet. Every passage had multiple turns at 60 to 120-degree angles. This accomplished several things. First, it protected occupants from blast damage. A grenade thrown into a straight tunnel could kill everyone in a 50-foot section. In a zigzagging tunnel, the blast was contained to maybe 10 feet. Second, it made shooting impossible. You couldn't fire a rifle in a straight line because there were no straight lines. Third, it disoriented intruders. After 3 or 4 turns in complete darkness, most people lost all sense of direction. The ventilation systems were engineering marvels. Air shafts rose from deep chambers to the surface, disguised as termite mounds or hidden in dense vegetation. The shafts were narrow, maybe 4 inches across, too small to drop grenades down, but sufficient to provide fresh air to dozens of people underground. Some shafts had chambers halfway up, where smoke from cooking fires could cool and disperse before reaching the surface, rendering the smoke invisible from 100 feet away. The Americans tried pumping gas and smoke into the tunnels to force the occupants out. The ventilation systems defeated these attempts. Watertight trapdoors could be closed to isolate sections, and the multiple air shafts meant that even if one was blocked, others continued providing oxygen. The Viet Cong also stored water underground, collected during the rainy season in clay pots and metal drums. They grew mushrooms in deep chambers, where the temperature and humidity were perfect. They raised fish in underground pools connected to surface streams through cleverly concealed channels. The tunnel complexes were self-sufficient ecosystems that could support hundreds of people for weeks at a time. But the most terrifying feature of the tunnels wasn't their size or sophistication, it was the traps. The Viet Cong rigged the tunnels with booby traps that represented a level of creativity in killing that most American soldiers had never encountered. Punji stakes were the most common, sharpened bamboo spikes, sometimes coated with human excrement to cause infection, hidden at the bottom of pit traps or angled downward along tunnel walls. A soldier crawling through darkness, feeling his way forward, would suddenly feel the stakes pierce his hands or push through his uniform into his chest. The stakes were positioned so that pulling back caused more damage. Some pits had secondary stakes pointing downward at angles. Once you fell in, removing yourself was nearly impossible without help. And help wasn't coming because the tunnels were too narrow for 2 people to pass each other. Grenade traps killed differently. A wire stretched across a passage, nearly invisible even with a flashlight. Touch the wire, and it pulled the pin on a grenade mounted in a wall cavity. The grenade would explode before the victim could even register what happened. Some traps were more elaborate. Boxes of scorpions rigged to fall when a tripwire was disturbed. Live snakes, often bamboo pit vipers or Malayan crates, tethered to bamboo poles that would spring forward when triggered. The ice snakes had a nickname among American soldiers, three-step snakes, because 3 steps was supposedly all you could manage after being bitten before the venom paralyzed your respiratory system. The reality was less dramatic, but equally deadly. The venom caused necrosis around the bite, turning flesh black and swollen. Without immediate treatment, which was impossible to provide in a tunnel 30 feet underground, most victims died from secondary infections within days. Cartridge traps operated on a simpler principle. A single rifle round placed in a short piece of bamboo tube, positioned vertically in a shallow depression in the tunnel floor. Below the cartridge, a nail embedded in a wooden board. Step on the cartridge, and your weight drove it down onto the nail, which acted as a firing pin. The bullet went straight up through your foot. Not always fatal, but absolutely incapacitating. And in a tunnel with no easy way to evacuate casualties, incapacitation meant death. The psychological impact of these traps exceeded their actual casualty numbers. A tunnel rat crawling through darkness knew that every inch forward might be his last. Every handful of dirt he grabbed could conceal a stake. Every breath could be his last before a grenade detonated. The stress was inhuman. Harold Roper, who entered tunnels in early 1960, later said he felt more fear during tunnel operations than at any other point in his life, before or since. You're moving forward knowing something horrible is waiting for you, but you can't see it, can't prepare for it, can't do anything except keep crawling and hope you're lucky. The American military response to the tunnels was initially catastrophic. The 8th Infantry Division, operating near Cu Chi in late 1965, had no training for tunnel warfare. When soldiers discovered a tunnel entrance, the standard procedure was to throw grenades down the hole and move on. This accomplished exactly nothing. The grenades exploded in the first chamber, maybe collapsing 10 feet of passage, while the rest of the network remained operational. Commanders tried flooding the tunnels with water. The Viet Cong simply closed the watertight trapdoors and waited. The water drained away or was absorbed by the clay, and operations resumed within hours. They tried pumping tear gas into the entrances. The ventilation systems dispersed it so thoroughly that concentrations never reached debilitating levels. They tried sending dogs down. The tunnels were too narrow, the traps too numerous. Several dogs died from snake bites before the program was abandoned. In January 1966, during Operation Crimp, 8,000 American and Australian troops combed the hobo woods looking for Viet Cong activity. B-52s had already bombed the area, dropping 30-ton loads that turned jungle into cratered wasteland. The troops found caches of rice and salt. They found foxholes and fighting positions. They found evidence of a regiment-sized force that had somehow vanished. For 3 days, they searched. Snipers harassed them constantly from positions that seemed to be inside their own perimeter. Soldiers would be killed by fire coming from ground they'd already secured. On the 4th day, Sergeant Stuart Green sat down to rest and felt a nail poke through his pants. He looked down and discovered a wooden trapdoor, perfectly camouflaged with dirt and vegetation, with air holes drilled through to allow ventilation. He'd found his first tunnel entrance. Colonel Robert Haldane ordered smoke grenades dropped into the entrance. Within minutes, red smoke began appearing from dozens of locations across the operational area. Every tree, every bush, every rice paddy seemed to be leaking smoke. The soldiers had found the tunnel network. Haldane ordered CS gas, a riot control agent, pumped into the tunnels. The Viet Cong simply closed their trap doors and waited. Hours later, when the gas dissipated, they reopened the tunnels and resumed operations. Eventually, Green and a demolition specialist re-entered the tunnel, placed explosive charges, and destroyed what they could reach. But the explosions were localized. The tunnels twisted and turned in ways that contained the blast damage to small sections. Destroying 100 feet of tunnel accomplished nothing when the network stretched 200 kilometers. Australian engineers from 3 Field Troop, under Captain Alexander McGregor, made the first serious attempt to explore the tunnels rather than simply destroying the entrances. They spent 4 days underground, mapping passages, documenting construction techniques, and cataloging what they found: ammunition, radio equipment, medical supplies, operating rooms with surgery tables carved from clay, sleeping quarters with hammocks strung between support posts, conference rooms where strategic planning had clearly taken place, service records for 148 Viet Cong fighters. The Australians revealed for the first time the true scope of what American forces were facing. This wasn't a collection of foxholes. This was an underground city. McGregor's men became known as tunnel ferrets. An American journalist, unfamiliar with ferrets, misheard the term as tunnel rats, and the name stuck. One of McGregor's men, Corporal Robert Botel, died when he became trapped in a dead-end passage and suffocated before his team could extract him. His death illustrated the primary danger of tunnel operations. It wasn't always the enemy that killed you. Sometimes the tunnels themselves were enough. The U.S. military realized it needed a new approach. General Williamson issued orders that tunnels had to be properly searched whenever discovered. No more throwing grenades and walking away. No more flooding or gassing without first determining what was down there. Actual exploration was required. The problem was finding soldiers willing to do it. In early 1966, Captain Herbert Thornton, a Chemical Corps officer with the 1st Infantry Division, was tasked with creating specialized teams to enter, clear, and exploit the tunnels. Thornton was 40 years old, a career officer who understood chemistry and engineering. He was also realistic about the challenges. Entering a Viet Cong tunnel wasn't like clearing a building or securing a fortified position. It was a job that required specific physical and psychological characteristics that most soldiers didn't possess. First, size. The tunnels averaged 18 inches wide. Soldiers taller than 5 feet 5 inches or heavier than 150 pounds couldn't navigate many sections. The 25th Infantry Division, like most American units, consisted primarily of men who were too large for tunnel work. Thornton needed to find the smallest soldiers in the division and convince them to volunteer for the most dangerous job in Vietnam. Second, mental toughness. Thornton later said, "A tunnel rat needed an inquisitive mind, enormous courage, and precise judgment about what to touch and what to leave alone, because one mistake would kill you instantly." The job required men who could function in claustrophobic darkness, knowing they might encounter an enemy soldier around the next corner, or a snake, or a grenade trap, or simply run out of air and suffocate. Third, reflexes. Confrontations in the tunnels happened at arm's length. There was no time to think, no time to plan. See the enemy, kill the enemy, all within a span of seconds. Hesitation meant death. Thornton interviewed dozens of soldiers. He rejected most of them. Too tall, too heavy, too nervous, wrong temperament. Eventually, he assembled his first team. James Henderson was among them. Henderson stood 5 feet 4 inches and weighed 135 pounds. He'd worked in confined spaces his entire life and demonstrated an unusual comfort with darkness and tight quarters. When Thornton asked if he understood the risks, Henderson's response was simple. More dangerous than getting hit by artillery while standing in the open? I'll take the tunnels. The tunnel rats underwent training that was improvised as Thornton figured out what worked. They learned to move silently. Most stopped showering with American soap, which had a distinct smell the Viet Cong could detect underground. Some adopted Vietnamese diets to alter their scent profile. They learned to feel for tripwires rather than rely on sight. In complete darkness, touch was the only sense that mattered. They learned to listen for breathing, for movement, for the subtle sounds that indicated another person was nearby. They experimented with weapons. The standard M11911 .45 caliber pistol was too loud. Firing it in a confined space left the shooter temporarily deaf, which was often a death sentence. Some tunnel rats switched to .38 caliber revolvers with suppressors. Quieter, but still not ideal. The best weapon turned out to be a knife or bayonet. Silent, reliable, never jammed, effective in close quarters. The knife served multiple purposes. It probed for traps, disabled tripwires, dispatched snakes, and killed enemy soldiers. One tool, multiple functions. Some tunnel rats carried flashlights. Others preferred darkness, believing that light made them targets. The debates about equipment were endless because everyone who survived developed their own techniques and superstitions. What worked for one person got another killed. There was no doctrine, no manual, no official guidance. The tunnel rats trained each other, passing knowledge from veteran to new recruit through experience rather than classroom instruction. Henderson's first tunnel was on January 8, 1966, during Operation Crimp. The entrance was a wooden trapdoor hidden under vegetation, with the same air holes that Sergeant Green had discovered by sitting on it. Intelligence believed it connected to a supply cache, maybe some ammunition, nothing significant. Henderson climbed down a vertical shaft about 12 feet deep. The shaft opened into a horizontal passage barely 2 feet high. He turned on his flashlight and immediately turned it off again. The beam had reflected off a tripwire stretched across the passage at chest height. In darkness, he traced the wire with his fingers. It led to a grenade mounted in a wall cavity. Standard trap. He disarmed it by cutting the wire with his bayonet, then continued forward. The passage turned left after 15 feet, then right, then descended at a sharp angle for another 20 feet. Henderson was now 30 feet underground, crawling through near total darkness, with no idea where he was going or what he'd find. He reached a junction, 3 passages branching in different directions. He chose the middle one, crawling forward another 50 feet, until the passage opened into a small chamber maybe 6 feet across. His flashlight revealed sleeping mats, cooking utensils, and evidence that people had been here recently. The air was stale but breathable, indicating active ventilation. He marked the chamber on his map and continued exploring. Over the next 4 hours, Henderson mapped over 300 feet of tunnel, discovering 3 more chambers, 2 vertical shafts that led to deeper levels, and what appeared to be a hospital complete with surgical instruments and medical supplies. He also found documents, service records, operational orders, maps of American positions around Cu Chi. The intelligence value was extraordinary. By the time Henderson surfaced at 7:30 a.m., he'd proven that the tunnels were far more extensive and significant than anyone had imagined. His report went up the chain to division headquarters. The response was dismissive. Intelligence officers argued Henderson had simply found a larger-than-average foxhole. Nothing to be concerned about. They were wrong, but admitting that would have required acknowledging that American forces had established their primary base directly on top of an enemy stronghold. That kind of admission doesn't happen quickly in military bureaucracies. Henderson went down again on January 12th. Different tunnel, same area. This time he brought specialist Thomas Morrison, another small soldier who'd volunteered for tunnel duty. They explored separately, each taking a different branch at the first junction. Henderson went left, Morrison went right. Henderson found an ammunition cache, rifles, explosives, mortar rounds, all carefully stored in a dry chamber with wooden shelving. Morrison found a classroom, desks carved from clay, a chalkboard made from smoothed wood, children's drawings on the walls. The tunnels weren't just military installations. They were where civilians lived during bombing campaigns, where children attended school when the surface was too dangerous, where community happened underground because the world above had become uninhabitable. The two soldiers marked everything they found, took photographs where possible, and returned to the surface after 6 hours. This time, their report was harder to dismiss. Two soldiers, two different tunnel systems, both revealing infrastructure that required years to build and served large populations. Division intelligence began taking the tunnel threat seriously. By February 1966, tunnel rat teams were operating daily across Kyu Chai District. The discoveries were constant and disturbing. On February 15th, a team found a working hospital 35 feet underground. Operating room, recovery ward, pharmacy stocked with both Vietnamese and American medicines. The Viet Cong had been treating their wounded in safety, while American casualties were evacuated under fire. On February 21st, another team discovered a conference room with detailed maps of the Kyu Chi base camp, including locations of ammunition bunkers, helicopter pads, and command posts. The enemy knew exactly where everything was because they'd built tunnels underneath it and observed from below. On March 3rd, tunnel rats uncovered a workshop producing mines and explosives using unexploded American ordnance. The Viet Cong were harvesting duds from B-52 strikes, disassembling them, and repurposing the explosives into booby traps that killed American soldiers. The irony was brutal. The casualty rate among tunnel rats was devastating. By March 1966, 12 of Thornton's original 30-man team were dead or too injured to continue. Punji stakes, snake bites, grenade traps. Some died in firefights with Viet Cong soldiers encountered in the darkness. Others suffocated when passages collapsed. Several were killed by their own explosives when demolition charges detonated prematurely in the confined spaces. Staff Sergeant Pedro Rejo Ruiz became known as the human probe for his willingness to enter tunnels known to be occupied by enemy fighters. He'd been fighting his entire life. As a teenager in Cuba, he'd harassed communist troops before fleeing to America. He saw Vietnam as a continuation of that fight. Rejo Ruiz went down tunnels that other tunnel rats refused to enter, often when another soldier had been wounded and needed extraction. He developed techniques for moving silently and navigating by touch that became standard training for new recruits. Sergeant Robert Batten volunteered for 2 additional tours with the tunnel rats, an almost unheard-of decision given the mortality rate. Batten and Thornton both ended up on the Viet Cong's most wanted list, listed just below top American generals because of how effective their teams had become at disrupting tunnel operations. The Viet Cong offered rewards for information leading to their capture or death. Neither was ever caught. The psychological toll was immeasurable. Tunnel rats experienced anxiety levels far beyond what was normal even in combat. The constant darkness, the claustrophobia, The knowledge that death could come from any direction, at any moment, created mental stress that many couldn't sustain. Some soldiers went down once and refused to ever do it again. Others became obsessed with the tunnels, like Rejo Ruiz, and couldn't stay away. The physical demands were equally brutal. Crawling through narrow passages for hours caused injuries to knees, elbows, shoulders. The tunnels were filled with ants, centipedes, spiders, rats. Mosquitoes bred in underground water sources. Soldiers emerged covered in insect bites and infected wounds. The heat underground was oppressive during dry season, the humidity approaching 100%. Breathing was difficult even with ventilation. Soldiers lost weight rapidly, despite eating well on the surface. The work burned calories at a rate that normal rations couldn't replace. Many tunnel rats developed chronic respiratory problems from inhaling dust and spores in the confined spaces. Some contracted diseases from exposure to the vermin and contaminated water that collected in lower passages. The job destroyed bodies almost as efficiently as it destroyed minds. In January 1967, General William Westmoreland launched Operation Cedar Falls, a massive assault on the Iron Triangle region that included Kyu Chi. 30,000 American troops, supported by armor, artillery, and air power, moved to destroy the Viet Cong stronghold once and for all. The operation began with heavy bombing. B-52s dropped hundreds of tons of explosives, pulverizing the surface. Then came defoliation. C-123 aircraft sprayed Agent Orange across thousands of acres, stripping away jungle canopy to expose tunnel entrances. Bulldozers followed, equipped with Rome plows that could tear down entire forests. The destruction was total. Villages were evacuated. Civilians were relocated. The Americans intended to turn the Iron Triangle into a dead zone where nothing could survive. The tunnel rats went in behind the bulldozers. On January 18th, teams from the 1st Battalion, 5th Infantry Regiment, 25th Infantry Division uncovered the Viet Cong district headquarters of Kyu Chi. The discovery was remarkable. 500,000 documents, maps of American bases showing defensive positions, artillery locations, helicopter pads, detailed records of Viet Cong movement from Cambodia into Vietnam, lists of political sympathizers in South Vietnamese government, plans for attacks on Saigon, even a failed assassination plot against Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The intelligence coup was enormous. It proved the tunnels were command and control hubs, not just hiding places, but it also proved something more disturbing. Despite months of operations, despite thousands of American soldiers searching the area, despite B-52 strikes and bulldozers and chemical defoliation, the tunnel network remained largely intact. Operation Cedar Falls destroyed maybe 10% of the total complex. The rest survived. The Viet Cong adapted. They moved operations deeper. Tunnels that had been 30 feet down were expanded to 40 or 50 feet. New ventilation shafts were dug. Entrances were relocated to areas the Americans had already searched, betting correctly that cleared ground wouldn't be searched twice. The watertight trapdoors, already effective, were improved with better seals. The booby traps became more sophisticated. By March 1967, American soldiers were encountering traps that hadn't existed 6 months earlier. One particularly nasty variant involved a grenade suspended in a water-filled chamber. The pin was pulled, but the water prevented the striker from igniting. The trap was positioned above a lower passage. A soldier crawling below would disturb a tripwire, draining the water, which allowed the striker to function normally. The grenade would fall and detonate in the confined space below. Dozens of tunnel rats died before this trap was understood and countermeasures developed. The war in the tunnels became a parallel conflict to the war on the surface. While divisions maneuvered and artillery dueled and helicopters flew combat missions, small teams of Americans crawled through darkness, fighting an enemy who knew every inch of their environment. The Americans had superior equipment and firepower. The Viet Cong had knowledge, patience, and an infinite capacity to endure conditions that would have broken most people. Life in the tunnels was horrific for everyone, American and Vietnamese alike. The Viet Cong soldiers who lived there full-time existed in conditions that challenged human endurance. Food was scarce. They ate cold rice with salt, drank unboiled water when supplies ran low. The air was perpetually stale despite ventilation. Disease was rampant. A captured diary from a Viet Cong soldier in 1967 included a typical entry, "Oh, what hard days. One has to stay in a tunnel, eat cold rice with salt, drink unboiled water." That was his final entry. He died from dysentery 3 days later. Malaria was the second largest cause of death among Viet Cong tunnel dwellers, surpassed only by combat wounds. A captured medical report suggested that at any given time, half the fighters in the tunnels had active malaria infections, and 100% had significant intestinal parasites. The darkness was psychologically devastating. Soldiers might spend weeks underground during intense bombing campaigns, emerging only at night to tend crops or retrieve supplies. Children were born in the tunnels. Some spent their entire early lives underground, never seeing sunlight until they were toddlers. The Americans couldn't understand how anyone endured it. The answer was simple. The alternative was worse. On the surface, American artillery and air power controlled everything. B-52 strikes killed indiscriminately. Villages were destroyed. Fields were poisoned with defoliants. The tunnels, horrible as they were, offered survival. That was enough. The 25th Infantry Division lived with the tunnel threat for 4 years. Soldiers stationed at Cu Chi knew the enemy was literally underneath them. Attacks came from within the perimeter with disturbing regularity. On January 3, 1969, a Viet Cong bomb exploded in a mess hall at Cu Chi Base Camp, killing 15 Americans from the 500 4th Engineer Battalion and 2 Vietnamese kitchen staff. Investigators found the bomber had entered through a tunnel, planted the explosive, and escaped the same way. On February 26, 1969, Pa Van sappers attacked the base, destroying 9 Chinook helicopters. They'd infiltrated through the tunnel network, moved through the base undetected, placed charges on the helicopters, and vanished back underground before anyone realized what was happening. Security was increased. Perimeter patrols were doubled. Motion sensors were installed. None of it mattered. The tunnels provided access that no amount of security could prevent. The Americans tried everything to destroy the tunnels permanently. Chemical contamination programs pumped CS riot agent into the passages. The agent would stick to walls and floors, causing nausea and painful burns when disturbed. It was moderately effective but temporary. The Viet Cong simply waited for the CS to degrade, then cleaned the affected areas. Acetylene gas mixed with oxygen and ignited with small charges worked better for shallow tunnels. The explosion would collapse passages and kill anyone inside. But deep tunnels survived. The blasts didn't penetrate past the first level. By 1969, B-52s were carpet-bombing Cu Chi and the Iron Triangle with delayed fuse bombs designed to bury deep before exploding. Thousands of bombs dropped over months. The surface was obliterated. Craters overlapped craters. The jungle ceased to exist. Satellite photos showed terrain that looked lunar. And still, the deeper tunnels survived, Investigators entering the tunnels after the carpet bombing found collapsed sections, certainly, but they also found chambers 40 feet down that showed no damage at all. The clay absorbed the shock waves. The tunnel design dispersed the blast energy. Short of excavating the entire district to bedrock, there was no way to eliminate the tunnels completely. In 1970, American strategy shifted. Instead of trying to destroy the tunnels, they tried to deny them. Large sections of Kyu Chai district were designated free fire zones. Anything that moved was considered hostile and engaged. Civilians were forcibly relocated. Villages were burned. The land was declared dead. Without a civilian population to support the tunnels, the thinking went, the Viet Cong couldn't sustain operations. The strategy failed. The tunnels had already proven they could support operations without surface assistance. Underground crops, stored food, captured supplies, all provided enough to keep the network functional. And when American forces withdrew from Kyu Chi in 1970, the Viet Cong immediately reoccupied the surface and resumed normal operations. 4 years of effort, thousands of casualties, billions of dollars in ordnance expended, and the tunnels remained operational. In 1968, the tunnels played a crucial role in the Tet Offensive. The massive coordinated attacks on cities across South Vietnam required months of planning and enormous movement of troops and supplies. The Kyu Chi tunnels served as staging areas. Thousands of fighters moved through the underground network, assembling near Saigon without being detected by American intelligence. When the offensive launched on January 30, 1968, Viet Cong forces seemed to appear from nowhere, attacking targets in Saigon with precision that suggested intimate knowledge of American positions. They had that knowledge because they'd observed from underground for years. The Tet Offensive failed militarily. The Viet Cong and NVA forces took catastrophic casualties and achieved none of their strategic objectives, but politically it was devastating. The American public, told repeatedly that the war was being won, saw enemy forces attack the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. The disparity between official statements and visible reality destroyed public trust. The tunnels had enabled that attack. Underground planning rooms, documented after the offensive, showed maps and operational orders that had been developed months in advance in chambers beneath Kyu Chi. The tunnel rats never received the recognition they deserved. There were only about 100 American tunnel rats during the entire war, spread across multiple divisions and units. Most died in the tunnels or from complications of injuries sustained underground. Others died in ambushes on the surface when they weren't doing tunnel work. The casualty rate exceeded 90% dead or wounded. No other specialty in Vietnam matched that rate, except perhaps helicopter pilots. The tunnel rats operated in complete obscurity. Their missions weren't mentioned in after-action reports. Their discoveries were classified. The strategic intelligence they provided was attributed to other sources. They volunteered for a job that offered virtually certain death or injury, received no special pay, no special training beyond what they taught each other, and no recognition. Their motto was non gratum anus rodentum, dog Latin for not worth a rat's ass. They chose it themselves. Dark humor from men who crawled through hell on a daily basis. James Henderson survived 11 months as a tunnel rat. On December 14, 1996, he entered a tunnel complex near Trang Bang, 15 miles west of Kyu Chi. The entrance was standard: wooden trapdoor, vertical shaft, horizontal passage. Henderson had been down similar tunnels hundreds of times. This one felt different. The air was wrong, too still, too quiet. He crawled forward anyway. 20 feet in, he found the trap, a pressure plate on the tunnel floor, invisible in the darkness, connected to explosives mounted in the walls. He realized what it was the moment his weight settled on it. The explosion was instantaneous. The blast wave, confined by the narrow tunnel, had nowhere to dissipate. Henderson absorbed the full force. He died before his team could reach him. They recovered his body 3 hours later. He was 21 years old, from Bakersfield, California, son of a construction worker who spent his life building things. Henderson's death was recorded as killed in action during ground operations. No mention of tunnels, no details about how or where. His family received a telegram, a folded flag, and assurances that their son had died serving his country. They never learned about the tunnels. They never knew what he'd really done. The 25th Infantry Division left Cu Chi in 1970. The base was turned over to ARVN forces. In April 1975, as North Vietnamese forces closed in on Saigon, Cu Chi base was hit by artillery and besieged. It fell on April 29th, one day before Saigon. The tunnels had outlasted the American presence. After the war, sections of the Cu Chi tunnels were preserved and open to tourists. Today, visitors can crawl through widened passages, see reconstructed conference rooms and hospitals, and marvel at the engineering achievement. The tourist sites show sanitized versions. The traps are defanged, the tunnels are lit. The passages are wide enough for Western tourists who would never fit in the original sections. The guides describe the tunnels as triumph of Vietnamese ingenuity and determination. They don't mention the soldiers who died there, American or Vietnamese. They don't talk about the malaria, the disease, the suffocating darkness, the psychological destruction. They present the tunnels as historical artifacts, divorced from the human cost required to build and fight in them. The American military learned lessons from Cu Chi that inform tunnel warfare doctrine to this day. Modern training includes tunnel clearing techniques derived directly from the tunnel rats' experiences. Special operations forces train for subterranean combat, using principles developed by men like Thornton, Rejo Ruiz, and Henderson. The equipment has improved. Night vision devices, suppressed weapons, communications gear, protective equipment that didn't exist in 1966, but the fundamentals remain unchanged. Tunnels are still narrow, dark, and deadly. Traps still kill. Claustrophobia still breaks soldiers. The psychological demands are still extreme. You can teach techniques, but you can't train away the fundamental reality that crawling through confined darkness toward an enemy who knows the terrain better than you will ever understand is terrifying in ways that don't exist in other forms of combat. The tunnels of Cu Chi represent one of the most remarkable military engineering achievements in history. A peasant army with hand tools dug a network that withstood 4 years of assault by the most technologically advanced military in the world. They built hospitals, schools, command centers, living quarters, all underground, all functional. They sustained operations that killed thousands of American soldiers and supported major offensive actions. They did it with almost no machinery, no modern equipment, nothing but human labor and determination. The cost was catastrophic. Thousands of Vietnamese died, building, maintaining, and defending the tunnels. Disease, malnutrition, combat, cave-ins all took their toll. The tunnels enabled survival, but survival in conditions that destroyed the people who endured them. Children who grew up underground suffered developmental problems. Adults who spent years in the tunnels experienced health complications that persisted decades after the war. The psychological damage was immense and permanent. The Americans who fought in the tunnels suffered equally. The tunnel rats, those who survived, carried the experiences for the rest of their lives. Most struggled with PTSD, though the term didn't exist yet when they came home. The claustrophobia, the darkness, the constant expectation of death, these things don't leave you. Harold Roper, who entered tunnels in 1966, later said the fear he felt underground exceeded anything else in his 60 years of life. He couldn't enter small spaces without panic attacks. He couldn't turn off lights when sleeping. The tunnel rats received almost no psychological support. They came home, were discharged, and were expected to reintegrate into civilian life as if nothing had happened. Many couldn't. Some never recovered. The strategic impact of the tunnels is difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. They denied the Americans control of critical terrain. They enabled operations that killed and wounded tens of thousands. They provided sanctuary and support that allowed the Viet Cong to sustain resistance even when surface operations became impossible. They supported the Tet Offensive, which didn't win the war militarily, but changed American public opinion in ways that ultimately led to withdrawal. Without the tunnels, the war in the South would have been very different. The Viet Cong couldn't have maintained operations in the face of American firepower without underground sanctuary. The tunnels weren't the only reason America lost in Vietnam, but they were significant. Conservative estimates suggest the tunnels were directly responsible for trapping, killing, or wounding over 10,000 American soldiers between 1960 and 1970. Trapped, meaning caught in situations where the tunnels enabled ambushes, provided escape routes for attackers, or complicated evacuations of wounded. The tunnels turned Cu Chi District into a killing ground that American technology couldn't neutralize. Lives saved by the tunnels, Vietnamese civilians who sheltered underground during bombing campaigns, probably number in the tens of thousands. Entire villages survived because they could retreat into the earth when B-52s came. The tunnels were humanitarian shelters as much as they were military installations. James Henderson's name appears on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., Panel 13E, line 126. His family visits occasionally. They stand in front of the black granite wall and remember a young man who enlisted at 19, served his country, and died at 21. They still don't know the details. They don't know about the tunnels, about the years of planning required to build them, about the tunnel rats who went down alone into darkness. They don't know their son was part of a small group of volunteers who fought a war that most people never saw and don't remember. Sometimes that's exactly right. The work was done. The mission was attempted, even if it ultimately failed. The men who did it didn't ask for recognition. They asked to survive, and most didn't get that either. The tunnels are still there. Sections remain accessible beneath what's now suburban sprawl around Ho Chi Minh City. Most are sealed or collapsed. Some are preserved as historical sites. A few, in remote areas, are still used by farmers for storage or shelter during storms. The clay walls hardened decades ago. They'll last centuries without maintenance. Physical evidence of a war that remade Southeast Asia and broke American certainty about military power. When historians study the Vietnam War, they focus on strategy, politics, cultural conflicts, generational divides. The tunnels rarely receive the attention they deserve. They're footnotes in most accounts, interesting details rather than central elements. But for the soldiers who fought in them, for the civilians who sheltered in them, for the tunnel rats who died in them, the tunnels were everything. The difference between survival and death, between victory and defeat, between a war that could be won and one that couldn't. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through doctrine and manuals and institutional knowledge, through people who encounter problems and solve them with whatever resources exist. The Viet Cong needed to survive American firepower. They dug tunnels. The tunnels worked. They expanded them. The Americans needed to neutralize the tunnels. They sent men down alone with pistols and flashlights. Some of those men survived long enough to develop techniques that others could learn. Knowledge spread through experience, not through formal channels. The institutions eventually caught up, writing manuals and creating training programs, but the real work happened in the moment, underground, in darkness, by people who had no choice except to improvise or die. The Cu Chi tunnels killed thousands and saved thousands. They enabled resistance and facilitated atrocities. They were engineering marvels and humanitarian nightmares. They represented the best and worst of what humans can accomplish under extreme pressure. And they're still taught, studied, analyzed, because the lessons remain relevant. Warfare evolves, but certain fundamentals persist. Determined people with limited resources can accomplish remarkable things. Technology doesn't guarantee victory. Sometimes the simplest solution, a hole in the ground, dug with hand tools, defeats billion-dollar weapon systems. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is volunteer to crawl alone into darkness, knowing you probably won't come back. The tunnels won. Not in any conventional sense. The Viet Cong didn't defeat the Americans in the tunnels. The tunnel rats discovered secrets, captured intelligence, disrupted operations. But the tunnels survived. The network remained functional until the Americans left. That's victory of a sort. They accomplished their purpose. They enabled survival and resistance. That's all they needed to do. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.